My name is Louis Almeida. I'm the teacher, student, coach, and mentor of the philosophy of Spinoza and Gurdjieff. Today's topic is about Spinoza, a 17th century philosopher who riled up the status quo in the 17th century. He wrote a book called The Theological Political Treatise, and in that book, he shook up the world. He dared to say that the Bible is not the Word of God. It's the word of men. And consequently, many of his works were banned during his lifetime. He wrote a book called The Ethics, which we're going to focus on today. The Ethics is a guide towards awakening the mind. It's called the Ethics, a higher level of consciousness. So I'm going to endeavor to explain Spinoza where some of you can follow and understand. Spinoza's works is very difficult. The particular book I recommend, and you can find this on my website, and if you want to follow me in the future, this is the book. It's the Elwes translation and the Dover edition. Let's get started. This, again, is the beginning process of learning about Spinoza. Because if you pick up Spinoza on your own, it's a challenge. It's difficult. It's written in the geometric form. Euclid's geometry, a geometric form, which is very difficult and challenging to follow. But yet he had a reason, a purpose in using this method of explaining his ideas. During his time, the idea of geometry explaining his truth, his clarity, was common. But today it's very challenging. However, you'll find many so-called philosophy teachers, professors from all over the world saw Spinoza as a challenge to understand. And again, Spinoza was called an atheist. Why? Because his ideas were contrary to traditional ideas of what God is. Spinoza's God is not a traditional, conventional God. God to Spinoza is nature, the whole of nature, comprised of infinite attributes. We are part of two, the attribute of thought and the attribute of extension. So the mind is from this attribute. The mind is a thinking thing. It's both conscious and unconscious states. We'll talk about that later. The body is part of the physical, the attribute extension, which is comprised of the physical universe. But you don't have to understand that. Let's get started. So on page 3 through 5, I'm going to emphasize the idea, and this is how we're going to begin. I'm just going to overview or read a few words and then elaborate on them. So let's go to page 3, that's at the beginning. Again, this particular book, the Ethics includes the correspondence and the improvement of the understanding. Prior to the 5 books of the Ethics, there is the part of God, another part 2 is the mind, part 3 are on the emotions, part 4 is on human bondage, and 5 is human freedom. However, prior to those 5 parts of the Ethics, there is the part called the improvement of the understanding. If we do not tackle or understand that part, you'll never understand Spinoza. But however, even to begin to understand the improvement of the understanding, you must be involved in a study group where there's a teacher or a student who's gone through the process, or a leader of a group who's gone through the process of understanding. I fortunately met my teacher at the age of 30, and now today, and that was 1970. Here it is 2019, the month is April 2019, and so I've been doing this over 40 years. And I would say that only in the last 10 years have I made really major progress in digging deeper into the understanding of Spinoza. So again, as I mentioned, I met my teacher in 1970. I was with him for over 20 years. I don't expect you to follow me for that long. I think if you work with me directly, you'll probably learn this within a year to 2 years to 3 years. Some of my students have been with me for 4 years and more. Currently, I have 12 students. I could use more. I think I have a limit of about 26 because I work one-to-one. And so let's get started. On page 3, Spinoza talks about, he says this: after experience has taught me that all the usual surroundings of social life are vain and futile. Now Spinoza is explaining his path of discovery. What was he looking for? He was looking for something that would give him eternal happiness, permanent happiness. Like everyone else, he was following after the rainbow. The rainbow comprised of fame, riches, the pleasures of the senses. He says all these occupy the mind where we don't really think of anything else. Today, the 21st century, man is going to go to the moon. And you'll find many different levels of individuals' financial status, from extreme poverty to extreme wealth. Individuals have gained much materially. Science today, and yes, mechanics and electronics, we're going to go to the moon. How great is that? But yet, emotionally, man has not changed one iota. Emotionally. He still remains in the primitive states of fear and hope. Pain, hate, and anger express his nature every day, many times a day. However, there's a key. I'm going to talk a little bit about Gurdjieff also, but this is going to be mainly Spinoza. Gurdjieff talks about the idea that man is asleep, but he doesn't say how to awake. He also talks about there's such a thing as an awake state of consciousness. Well, what does that mean, and how does one come to an awake state of consciousness? This is where I found Spinoza. Again, Spinoza, he was following the status quo. Let's go after riches, let's go after fame, and let's pleasure ourselves. Why not? These are good things. But yet, we lose ourselves. And many of us die from our quest. Pleasure of the senses is a good example. Many of us are so consumed with the idea of food. Food is a pleasurable thing. It's called comfort food. High in fat, high in sugar, and high in fat, sugar, and salt. I love that. Well, however, the body isn't designed to consume a lot of it. And that's the problem. We consume too much. So that's the pleasures of the senses. Also, sex is a high pleasurable state of being. Sex is necessary for procreation, to extend the human race. It's a great pleasurable place, feeling, ecstasy, but yet many of us are so consumed with sex that the internet, pornography, it's one of the major, source of revenue. And there's nothing wrong with that if it's done in a limited way. But some of us are so consumed with it. And this is a problem. Riches, fame, and the pleasures of the senses. If we cannot, control them or moderate them, limit their power, then we are overwhelmed by the desire. So Spinoza, he saw limitations in these desires. And so he's wondering, there aren't a lot of happiness. Well, I mean, of course we get happiness from these things, but it's not lasting. So Spinoza was looking for something that was lasting. And now, let's go further, page 3, 4, and 5 of the Ethics. Spinoza began to define his search He was wondering, he asked a question, is there something new that was lasting, that was available? And what was that? He began to question it, and a thought, an idea came to him. And this is where reason and intuition are so important to understand Spinoza and Gurdjieff and other philosophies. Reason gives us an idea how things are made or put together. Reason has to do with the physical universe. Science, mathematics deals with reason. Physics, mechanics, electronics, all has to do with physics and also mechanics. And reason is expressed. But there's a higher level. The highest level of consciousness is called intuition. Intuition allows us to see the nature and the essence and the idea of things, the heart of them, the meaning of things. Without intuition, man would remain on the level of reason, which is a good level, but it's not fulfillment. It's not true enlightenment. There's such a thing as enlightenment in the individual. Some of you may scoff at the idea of enlightenment. I think yoga, meditation, Eastern philosophy, and probably Buddhism also talks about enlightenment. But what does that mean? It's such a vague idea, or it's a word, but what does it mean? Enlightenment to Spinoza is a higher level of consciousness. There are 3 levels to Spinoza's work. And this is on page 8 through 10 of the Improvement. Let's go to page 8. He talks about the idea that there are 4 levels of perception. And I'll give you an example of what Spinoza is expressing on page 8. Having laid down these preliminary rules, I will betake myself to the first and most important task, namely the amendment of the understanding, and the rendering it capable of understanding things in the manner necessary for attaining our end. In order to bring this about, the natural order demands that I should here recapitulate all the modes of perception which I have hitherto employed for affirming or denying anything with certainty, so that I may choose the best, at the same time begin to know my own powers and the nature which I wish to perfect. Now that's a lot of words. And one thing about Spinoza, in his language, he uses 17th century ideas, or say words, and this is the problem. What we'll have to do is dig deeply to understand what is he communicating, and that's where I came in. This is where I come in. As my teacher showed me, I can show you. Ask some of my students. One of my ex-students, his name is Martin Butler. He has he had a podcast called Corporeal Fantasy. Some of you may have seen it. It's very good. He also has now what is called, he also teaches Spinoza. And you can find him, just look for Martin Butler. He has some very good ideas, but he was one of my ex-students. And so he had Spinoza on the shelf for 10 years. And when he came to me, after 3 years, he began to really get a grasp of Spinoza. There are 3 levels of knowledge. The first level is called hearsay and experience. The second level is reason. And the third level is intuition. All these different levels of knowledge also express different levels of consciousness. The first level, hearsay and experience, tells us about a life, how to live in life, how to exist. And we don't do that very well. Buddha is aware that man suffers. Why? Because he lives in this first level of knowledge. Schopenhauer talks about the force of nature. And these forces come about from nature or God's nature. If an individual lives in the very first level of knowledge, hearsay, and experience, he's going to suffer. And suffering means that we do not understand our nature. We live and are governed by our desires and emotions. So Spinoza decided, or looked for, what was the best way to perceive reality. He began to see that there are 4 levels, and that's what you'll see on page 8, 4 levels of perception. So I want you to read that, and when you have a question, email or text me, or not text me, but say put it on my video. Just subscribe, and you'll subscribe to my other videos also. We're not going to go too far with this, but you can see how difficult this is. So we have in front of us on page 8 4 levels of perception. I want you just to go over them. And the second and the third and the fourth level are the highest level of perception, and those are the levels that we want to begin to learn and employ, to work with. And I want to emphasize something. To understand ourselves, that is the work. And that's why Spinoza is so important. We can use Spinoza to rise above our ordinate level of existence, and we are governed by our desires and emotions, and so our life is not very happy. We go into depression, or we go into anger very easily. And now, my next topic is going to be not only the 4 levels of perception, but the 3 levels of knowledge, and to know our emotions, particularly hate, pain, and anger, and desire. We'll talk about that in our next video. Bye for now. Take a look at my website, wayofspinoza.com, and there you'll find the books that you need. I don't get any compensation for Spinoza's Ethics or In Search of the Miraculous, and those are the 2 books I recommend, but particularly Spinoza's Ethics. I'll see you next time.